Well, one of the things I find must have been really, I believe, was really wonderful in the early church was that it wasn't large. I mean, numerically, it was just beginning and it was beginning to multiply. But in many ways, so many of the people were interconnected relationally. They had come out of similar backgrounds and cultures and were part of the same community. We're told that the churches, I don't know how exactly they measure it, but the scholars tell me that churches were probably small group gatherings, maybe at the most 50 people. And that may be simply because the physical structures didn't sustain larger meetings, and the climate in many parts where the church was growing wasn't really amenable to large groups of people being outside for any length of time. And so, I think there's something about that because, someone once said that the best teaching is what takes place across a dining room table. In other words, the idea that when you're talking one-on-one with somebody, that's where we really derive the most help and instruction. And I've been really encouraged and gratified by having so many of you share that you kind of feel like that's what happens here. I've had people who have been part of my congregation for decades who told me that I never felt like I really got to know you until I started going through these daily devotionals. I don't know if that's good, bad, or ugly, but the simple fact is that we benefit the most when we feel like we are having a meaningful interaction and a personal conversation with somebody, because we all yearn to have people in our life that we can walk through life together with. And so the early church, when Paul says here in this closing statement, everyone with me sends you greetings. It's kind of interesting because everybody who was with Paul, who was part of his team, knew who Titus was. And some have suggested that Titus didn't fare well towards the end. I think that's an assumption that we can't necessarily take to the bank. But the reality is that he was part and parcel. He was closely connected. He had been through thick and thin with this group of men and women that were part of Paul's entourage traveling around the world. And Paul essentially saying is, we haven't forgotten about you. We're thinking about you. We care about you. And your welfare and your destiny is really important to us. We want you to succeed at what you're doing. It's amazing because I think that many times that's what our children want to hear from us. They want to hear that we are pleased with how they're living and the decisions they're making. And I get it. Some of you are going to say to me, well, my child isn't making good decisions and they're not headed in the right direction. I understand that pain and that struggle and that difficulty. Believe me, I really do understand that. But still, what is it that you want? You don't want them to get decimated because of their actions. You want them to come to a place where they humble themselves, kind of like the prodigal son who says, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. The prodigal son left home because he was very angry and bitter towards his father and his older brother. And so he went as far away from them as he could possibly get and really kind of rejected all of their values. Everything that they had taught by living a controlled and frugal life. He wasted his life, his living, if you will, but not just the money. He wasted his health and his welfare. He destroyed his reputation. And so, when we read about how that the father of the prodigal sees him coming from a distance, it means that he's been praying for a long time and looking at the horizon saying, God, bring him back. And I think as parents who have prodigal children, that's where we need to be. We need to be praying that God will bring them back into right relationship, first with God, and then secondly with you. And why do I put it in that order? Because it's the breakdown of their relationship with God that was the reason for the breakdown of their relationship with their family members. The Bible says very clearly, honor your mother and father. And it says if you do that, your life will prosper and you'll live a long life. So if you want a prosperous and lengthy life, in other words, the idea of living life to its fullest, then it begins by treating your parents with love and respect and honoring them. You don't go around trash-mouthing them, putting them down, criticizing them, telling people why they're responsible for everything that's dysfunctional in your life. That's kind of the way it's become in our culture. We make a lot of excuses. As I have pointed out many times, you can blame your parents for the first 40 years of your life, but the second 40 years of your life are on you. You supposedly know enough to know to what you should do and shouldn't do. And if you're not making headway, then that's on you. I think that we live in a culture which wants to escape personal responsibility and make excuses and project our failures on someone else. And the only thing that's wrong with that, not only does that destroy relationships, but it doesn't fix yours and it doesn't fix you. You're going to be stuck in the same place. So I would say that if you're listening here and you have this issue, this bitterness, resentment towards especially your own family members, you need to begin by asking God to forgive you for that. Because Paul talked about being void of natural affection. You're not loving them because you should naturally love them, but instead you've given yourself permission to be hateful and dismissive and even abusive and neglectful. So, it's really important, I think, that we not only have the attitude that we're letting our kids know that we are rooting for them, we're in their corner, we're praying that they would succeed, that I want all of my sons to reach levels of success in life that's above and beyond what I have. And yet, and I think sometimes I find fathers who are jealous of their son's success and their behavior, and which I just don't even get and understand. I want to make excuses to brag on my kids and talk about how wonderful they are. But Paul makes it very clear to Titus, you need to understand, you're out here, you got a tough task, it's a challenging situation, but we are praying for you. We are on your team. We are hoping that you'll be successful. I'm hoping you'll do a better job than I could ever do, and that the Church of Crete becomes this vibrant source of gospel messaging because you so faithfully carried out your task. And you can reap those rewards in heaven because that's what's going to happen. So, Paul wasn't territorial. He wasn't worried about whether or not he was going to get the praise or recognition, because he had already seen the Lord, and he knew seeing Jesus was more than enough that anybody needs to feel good about eternity. And so, when we begin to look at life in that lens, it changes the pettiness. It kind of squeezes the pettiness out of it, the jealousy, the striving, and so forth. And we begin to celebrate other people's success. That's why, again, Paul goes on, he says, greet those who love us in the faith. So Paul understood there were people in Crete who did not like Paul or the church and really had everything out for them. There were many, especially within the Jewish community, and I would say that even Jewish Christians who wished Paul the worst and thought he was terrible. And he says, so, don't spend a lot of time, don't bother saying greetings to them, but there are people that love us there. And by giving them our greetings, what he's saying is that we want to let them know that we care about them as well. And I found this is really important. I mean, I have so many connections around the world with different people and different things that I find it's challenging, but I really do try to continue to let them know, hey, been thinking about you, praying, I hope things are going well. I don't do it as much as I wish I could, but it's important because I know people who are serving in some really difficult situations. And I know that when they know that people like you and me are praying for them and thinking about them and wishing them well, that we're on that prayer list. And that is encouraged to them. It's encouraging to me when people say that to me. Because what it is essentially is extending in a very real way what Paul says at the very end of the letter. Grace be with you all. That when you greet them with God's goodness and you say, you're in our hearts, you're on our minds, we're wishing well for you and we're praying that you prosper in the Lord, then that's really speaking grace into their life. Grace be with you all. Can you imagine how many of those young believers who had come to Christ when Paul first went there with Titus and, they were received in the body of believers, and now Paul left, and I'm sure that was like heartbreak. It's like having your father move off to another country, and yet to get a letter from him and for Titus to sit down with this group of people and saying, I got a letter from the Apostle Paul, and he said to tell you, each and every one of you, that he greets you in grace, that he's thinking about you, he cares about you, he's not forgotten who you are. It's in the C.S. Lewis movie called Shadowlands, one of my favorite all-time movies, C.S. Lewis supposedly meets a young writer, a student of his, who is writing on a train, and he asks the young man, why do you write? And his answer always spoke to me. He responded saying, because when I write, I don't feel like I'm alone. And I thought, in this world, most people battle that feeling of being alone, that people have forgotten about me. I know that my father-in-law, when he was 100 years old, I was calling him. My wife and I rotated. We call him every day that we could. And it got pretty difficult, pretty challenging, because as his memory began to slip, we kind of had the same conversation over and over and over again. But why did we do it? Well, it wasn't because we were trying to get information, but we really felt that we needed to let him know that he hadn't been forgotten, that we still knew he was there, and that we still cared about him. I remember one time he said to me, "Is your wife mad at me?" And I said, "Why do you say that?" "Well, because I haven't heard from her in a long time." And I said, "Tom, she just called you this morning." And he goes, "There's my problem. I can't remember anything." But it was just good, I mean, you could get irritated by that, but someday that'll be you and me if the Lord allows us to hang around this place that long, God forbid. But the whole point is that we all want to feel like we're valued, that we're important, that we make a difference, and that if we weren't there, we would be missed. You have people in your life that maybe people aren't doing it to you and you've gotten upset about that. They've kind of neglected and forgotten about you. But what about the people around you? They too would love to have somebody say, "Hey, I was thinking about you and I've been praying for you." And it doesn't matter your circumstance, that will lift people's minds and hearts. I find that even times, I mean, this is kind of crazy, but when I used to fly alone by myself without my wife, I try not to do that anymore because I enjoy being with her. But I remember I would be sitting next to some people. Oftentimes we get into a conversation flying across the ocean, And it was really simple, as they begin to talk about their lives and things they're going through, I would simply say, "Can I pray for you?" And I would pray for them right there if they'd let me. But also it's the idea of writing down their name and saying, "I'm going to continue to pray for you. And if you want to contact me, here's where you can reach me." And it's kind of crazy, because you can have those kind of life-changing impacts upon people that you may have before never even noticed they were there. But the fact that you were paying attention to them and considering them so much that you would pray for them. Most people have never had anybody that they know of say, "I'm going to pray for you," and do it. That's powerful. Don't overlook it. Well, Titus has been great. It's been a joy. And I'll be with you next week, and when I figure out what it is we're going to talk about. God bless you and go in His grace. In Jesus' name.